Our guest speaker this morning, I think, has a very important and poignant message for all of us. I think he is going to reconfirm our belief in our ideals and in our goals. And since 1979, he has spent his time working with the American Economic Council as its Vice President and Director of Public Affairs. He has been campaigning almost full-time around the country, educating people about deficit spending, inflation, the evils of taxation. He's always an interesting and stimulating speaker, and I really think that his message this morning is something that will rekindle the feelings that we've had on and off over the past few years, and we sometimes forget when we get bogged down in bylaws and constitutions and platforms. I think his message tells us really what it is that we're all about. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Breck McKinley.
Actually, this is really great for me. I've had some wonderful things happen in the last 12 months. I was actually given the choice of being the keynote speaker for the Democrats, the Republicans, or the Libertarians. And since I prefer to remain anonymous, I decided to come here today. I'm sure you've all heard, we're always trying to make quick distinctions between the Democrats and the Republicans. Now, I think there's some of us who could say that there's not much of a distinction to be made there. But I did hear a story recently, tragic story, of course. A man who was drowning 50 feet off the end of a pier, and a Republican came along and saw him and threw him 25 feet of rope and told him to swim for it. The Democrat came along and threw him 100 feet of rope and then dropped his end and went off to look for another good deed to do. I've never really come up with a satisfactory explanation of what the Libertarian did when he saw him, but most likely, that's right, I'm taking suggestions, selling the rope. I also thought that possibly if he got there before the man went down for the third time, that he could give him a little lecture on self-sufficiency. Being a libertarian, for me, and I'm sure for all of you, is a constant identity crisis. The conservatives hate us because they think we're liberals, and the liberals hate us because they think we're conservatives. And I had the importance of nomenclature and the distinction of terminology brought home very forcefully recently. This, of course, is a true story. Young lady friend of mine was given a very expensive dog, a European dog, and one that she grew instantly fond of and was constantly fawning over it and feeding it little tidbits and grooming it, and one day discovered a little growth behind its ear and was being instantly alarmed. Took her expensive German dog down to the doctor, the veterinarian, and said, there's this growth back here and I'm very worried about it. And the doctor looked at it and he says, well, I don't think it's a problem. It looks like an ingrown hair. Why don't you go down to the drugstore and get some Nair and just put it on there and let's get that hair off and let's just see what it is. So she went into the pharmacy and she was looking around and couldn't find the Nair. And she was looking and finally the pharmacist says, may I help you? And she said, well, yes, I'm trying to buy some Nair. And he said, well, you'll have to tell me what it's for, really, because he says, if you're going to put it on your underarms, I have a notice here, and I have to keep it behind the counter now, because the manufacturer says that if you put it on your underarms, you shouldn't wear a nylon blouse for at least a week afterwards. She says, no, that's not a problem. I'm not going to put it on my underarms. And he said, well, if you're going to put it on your legs, he said, you shouldn't wear stockings for at least a week. And she says, no. I'm not going to put it on my legs, and I'm not going to put it on my underarms. I'm going to put it on my schnauzer. And he said, well, in that case, you shouldn't ride a Honda for at least a month. So you can see how much trouble you can get in if you don't have your terms really clearly defined. The function of a keynote speaker, I'm told, is to set the tone for a conference such as this, to sort of remind attendees why they're here, to revitalize goals and purposes. And that's certainly fine in theory, but it's the theory that was never meant to encompass the spectrum of interests which tend to motivate libertarians, since we tend to run the gamut of the fellow who lives in the hills with his gun and a backpack on down to the more conservative types such as Jack Dean here. So I've decided to stick to a subject about which I do know something, and that's why I'm here, the things which move me. It's a given that I'm preaching to the choir. I'm not as nervous about it as I used to be because I did get to speak to God one time. Bob Lefebvre was at one talk at a libertarian supper club that Jack Dean puts on. And here at least I'm talking to the archangels, but at least it's not as bad as having God in the audience again. So don't be offended if I sound like I have rediscovered the obvious, because I have to really deal with the things that excite me and the things that motivate me. Or as I heard one of my son's girlfriends say to him recently, whatever floats your boat, honey. Well, you're about to hear what floats my boat. I had occasion to read Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. It's been now about 3 years ago. And it was truly a moving experience. I mean, I think we all read books that are pivotal in our lives, and certainly this was one of the pivotal books I read in my life. Unfortunately, it's 2,000 pages long. And so when I set out to write this talk, I thought, well, I'll just run through it and dig out some specific facts. I knew what I wanted to find, and I got so caught up in it that I ended up reading nearly the whole thing again. The book is in 4 volumes. It's 3 books. It's actually a total of 1,930 pages. But if I'm successful today, my talk will be perceived as a polemic. If you perceive it as an attack upon Ronald Reagan's evil empire of Soviet Russia, though, you will have missed the point. I will have failed and wasted not only my time, but yours as well. But it is a polemic. The book is a promise kept. A promise to all those who died that their story would not die with them if Solzhenitsyn lived. He wrote the book, interestingly, in its original form. Each day within the camps, a large postage stamp sized piece of paper is handed out to each of the prisoners with a pencil. And then it has to be turned in again at the end of the day. And he managed to draft and compile the facts and figures and the original concepts and most of the stories using that little postage stamp-sized piece of paper and committing it to memory each day like some epic poem of old, which he would then reread, memorize, and then add to what he had memorized from the days before, going back through everything he'd written up to that particular moment so as to remember it. The book is a memorial, in fact, a memorial to the 66 million minimum who perished in these camps, and the 15 to 30 million additional who starved to death in the famines which followed the extermination of the kulaks, and about which I'll talk more later as to who the kulaks were and how this happened. Solzhenitsyn was a meticulous scholar who expected to be disbelieved. He drew upon approved as well as banned records and accounts to corroborate his history, and faithfully notes when a particular fact could not be verified. The Gulag Archipelago was published after August of 1973, when a Leningrad woman who was holding a portion for safekeeping broke down after 120 sleepless hours of questioning and revealed its location, and then committed suicide. Solzhenitsyn had planned not to publish the book for some years after that. He wanted to wait until all of the people that he mentioned were no longer able to be reached by the Soviet secret police and persecuted for what he revealed in the book. The Gulag Archipelago comes from the term Gulag, which is the Soviet penal system under Stalin. It's a Russian acronym for Chief Administrator of Corrective Labor Camps. Archipelago, from the image of one far-flung country with millions of natives consisting of an archipelago of islands contained within another country, the USSR. A map of Soviet Russia with these camps overlaid, literally. It's like somebody had shot a shotgun blast of small pellets at the country. These camps were everywhere. As I go over the topic and the account of the people who were in these camps, bear in mind that 5 years sentenced to the Gulag was a death sentence. Prisoners were divided into those who went out on general assignment work every day and therefore quickly died off, and those who got quote-unquote cushy jobs within the camp boundaries who had some hope of surviving. Solzhenitsyn survived because of a small lie lost in the trauma of the admissions procedures. He said he studied atomic physics. It was a flat-out lie. The interesting thing is that as he was about to expire, literally was just about on his last feet and had reached that point, he points out in the book that you could usually tell when somebody was going to die. There was sort of a turning point for them. He had reached that point when suddenly he was summoned out of the camp and put him back in the main prison in Moscow, in a cell packed with atomic scientists, because the U.S. had just exploded the A-bomb and Russia wanted an A-bomb. And in the time that it took them to process the people who were being pulled in, he managed to get an education in atomic physics from the people who were locked in there with him and went on to work on Russia's atomic programs. So he lived as a result of this. To make my point, though, it's only the madness I need or want to convey. I believe it would be a distraction to focus on the political or geographic borders within which the madness occurred. But just to pick one madness in particular, Stalin needed a socialist construction project for the world to see. The Belmoral Canal was to be built in 20 months, starting in winter, in an area not far from Finland, actually somewhat north of Finland. 100,000 died in the first 3 months. Why? Because there were no camps there. They loaded the prisoners on the boxcars. There was one instance that caught my attention, a woman who arrived in the 50 below zero temperatures in a silk dress because she'd been arrested when she'd come out of the opera in Moscow. They just rounded her up, and by the time she was processed and sent to the camp, of course, they hadn't given her any other clothes. So people died. No camps or shelters existed, just signs indicating where the camp would be. The trains unloaded the prisoners into the snow. The dead were stacked to provide shelter for the living. More train loads arrived, and the camp was built, and so was the canal. Unusable to this day because it was only 16 feet deep and it was too shallow to ever use. The Holocaust pales to insignificance when compared to the horrors of the Gulag. The details of what went on during interrogation and within the camps is more horrible than anything I can compare it to, and that's after reading 10 to 15 autobiographical accounts of the Nazi extermination camps. 2,000 pages were required by Solzhenitsyn to chronicle those horrors, but my purpose today is not served by such a chronicle. Plus, I wouldn't know where to begin. Don't try to imagine it, because your imagination will fall far short. These were murder camps. It was not intended that anyone would survive, and few did. But remember again, this is not a chronicle of Russian villainy, but rather a chronicle of bureaucratic villainy, a bureaucracy run amok. Mine is the Frankenstein's monster theory of government. Without constant monitoring, and even perhaps then, it is the nature of government institutions to acquire a life of their own and then proceed to devour their creators. Wars are a good microcosmic model of this. There is a point where critical mass is reached, and then, whether in the world of physical or social phenomena, the event acquires a life of its own. Like a runaway horse, you reach a point where it is obvious that you have ceased to ride the animal and have become an unwilling and captive passenger. At that point, one can be forgiven if his goals quickly narrow to focus on just getting out alive. So, on to madness. And what better way to illustrate this madness than a catalog of the Gulag's inhabitants, as Solzhenitsyn called them, and the people. These are the people who were rounded up, and the grounds for their arrest, remembering always that they were not expected or meant to survive, let alone return. So who were some of these inhabitants? By the way, from about 1937 on, just to get this in perspective, there were 10 to 15 million incarcerated in the Gulag at any given time. I picked as the first one because having been a teacher for a number of years, something Jack didn't mention, and having been a student for many years before that, as we all have been, and tucked away in state schools where we all didn't want to be as a rule, there was the 11-year-old schoolgirl who, in writing an essay, remarked during World War II that if indeed the Germans were going to have to bomb Russia, could they at least bomb her school? She got 10 years in the Gulag. There was a man who, during the war, carried hay on his sledge for the Germans. He got 20 years. Remember all the exchange students? Maybe you don't remember, but during Khrushchev's era in power, we were flooded with Russian exchange students in this country. They went to undergraduate school here, the graduate school, went on, got PhDs, went home, got 5 years automatically in the Gulag for contact with the West. Everyone who had ever belonged to a political group other than the Communist Party in Russia at one point was rounded up, if not in 1922, then 1932, or 1937. Priests, theosophists, mystics, spiritualists, and mass arrests of Orthodox believers, monks and nuns and active laymen, the old people and women, the stubborn, ordinary believers. Solzhenitsyn says the root destruction of religion in the country, one of the most important goals of the GPU, which was the internal police. They were called the Chekas at that time. All persons convicted of religious activity got what they called a tenor, which was 10 years in the Gulag. Someone said, you can pray freely, but just so God alone can hear. And the author of that got 10 years. The true believers who refused to work on Sunday. The priests for refusing to betray the confidence of the confessional. Nationalities. The Yakuts. Now, when we talk about nationalities, we're talking about a suite. Names that I don't necessarily recognize, but that I'll just, and this may be one of the few times they get to be heard. The Yakuts, the Buryat Mongols, they shot 35,000 of the Buryat Mongols. The Kazakhs, the Kalmyks, the Chechens, the Ingush, the Balkas, the Crimean Tatars, all on the basis of blood. Didn't matter if they were heroes of the revolution, heroes of labor, heroes of war, or even Communist Party members. They were rounded up and sent to the camps. Then when the government needed gold, when the balance of payments was a problem, they called it the gold wave, and all those who at one time or another had had a private business, this is as much as 15 years before, or had been involved in retail trade, had earned wages at a craft, and could have, according to the GPU deductions, hoarded gold, were rounded up and tortured to reveal the source of the gold. And then the kulaks. You remember I mentioned the 15 to 30 million who starved. Whole families, even the 6-year-old children, went into the camps. It was the first such experience in modern history, and only later did Hitler repeat with the Jews. Solzhenitsyn says nothing to be compared to it in Russian history. People in the cities noticed nothing wrong until a strange 3-year famine hit. Now, what was a kulak? Well, before 1917, generally a kulak was a term applied to a farmer, usually a farmer who had at least one other person working for him. After 1917, it applied to all those who in any way hired workers. Soon, all strong people in general were being called strong in management, strong in work, or merely strong in convictions. They exterminated the able, the doers, the entrepreneurs, the movers and shakers of that whole society. Soon, nothing worked. So then, of course, they had to replace it with the people from the cities. And in the cities, they had to replace it with people who at least could take over the jobs, but nothing worked. So they rounded up those who replaced the kulaks, sent them off as wreckers of the revolution. So to go on with the inhabitants. Agronomists who failed to follow Lysenko's instructions were rounded up. And those who followed his instructions too well were rounded up too. The latter sowed flax on the snow as instructed. When the seed swelled and grew moldy, off they went. And then this story is great for any of us who've ever gone through anything similar. There's the factory manager. In a small province, they were having a provincial meeting, and then they were using one of the large assembly areas. And at the end of the meeting, they stood to applaud a picture of Stalin. And they applauded, 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 and for 11 minutes they applauded because nobody wanted to be the first one to stop applauding. And if anything, it grew more and more frantic. Now, if you've ever tried to applaud for 11 minutes, you know that it's a workout. So, finally, the factory manager stopped applauding, and he was arrested. And his interrogator pointed out to him at the end of his interrogation, after he'd gotten his 10-year sentence, don't ever be the first to stop applauding. Please remember that as I finish my talk today. Then there was a little community of Tashkent. Received a telegram in the 30s when they started the really big purge in 1937. It said, send 200, because it was done on a quota basis. They didn't care who you sent, but they said, send 200. Well, they had a problem. They'd rounded up everybody they could think of in their prior sweep, and they couldn't think of who to round up. But fortunately, a band of gypsies had just camped in the town square, so they just rounded them all up and sent them off as enemies of the people. Got 10 years. All their own spies were called home and arrested. All the socialists. For years and years and years and years, there was this sort of, I would call it an internecine dispute between the communists and the socialists. But they had been arresting the socialists on a variety of pretexts. Finally just resolved it. They just rounded them all up in the 30s and sent them to the camps. Then there was a mine surveyor. I love this. He was putting 2 tunnels through, and the tunnels went like this. They didn't meet. So he got 20 years. 6 geologists missed some tin deposits. They got 10 years. 30 school teachers. Now, in this, you have to hear this context. There was a great stress placed on the part of this bureaucracy on doing everything legally. So you had to have not only a confession, but in order to have a conspiracy, you had to have more people involved than just one. So you had to torture them until they gave you some other names. And you had to have something they had done. So they arrested them for arranging for a New Year's tree in order to burn down the school. Now, on the face of it, that's funny, except that 5 died during the interrogation. 24 died in the camps, and 1 lived to tell the story. And that's about the percentage of the survivors. Then in the 30s again, in 37, they had rounded up all the ranking party members, just a clean sweep. Prior to 37, it was communists rounding up everybody else. From 37 on, it was communists rounding up communists. So then they rounded up all the wives of those who had been rounded up as the party leaders, because the party leaders had been sent off what they called 10 years without right to correspond. Well, 10 years without right to correspond means that they were executed before they ever were sent to the camps. So they rounded up the wives just in case. Then the electrician who had a high-tension line break in his district, he got 20 years. 3 small boys came from Poland, and they grew up and were arrested as Polish spies and given 10 years for espionage. Streetcar motorwoman was walking home from work one night. Walked by a truck. It was broken down. The people were working on it. She could see arms and legs of dead, the bodies hanging out of the back of the truck. They got her name, called her in, asked her what she saw. She told them. And she got 10 years for anti-Soviet agitation. A plumber, a loudspeaker in all the apartments in Moscow. All day long, they read letters to Stalin. He got tired of that, turned it off, got 8 years. A tailor, one day, looked up from his work, stuck his needle in a newspaper on the wall, just so he wouldn't lose it, but he happened to stick it in Stalin's eye. He got 10 years for terrorism. Then a saleswoman happened to jot an order on Stalin's picture in a newspaper. You got it. She got 10 years. A deaf and dumb carpenter hung his hat and coat on a bust of Lenin. He got 10 years. A woman was arrested as she was leaving church and accused of praying for Stalin's death. Solzhenitsyn says he wonders how they knew. 25 years. And the stove maker, semi-literate, proud of his ability to write his name. Unfortunately, he wrote it across Stalin's face in an old newspaper, 10 years for anti-Soviet agitation. And then there was the entire jazz orchestra that was sent off as enemies of the people. I was thinking as I read this, and it's terrible to make fun out of something like this, but it's a good thing that James Watt didn't have this power, or the Beach Boys would no longer be with us. 30,000 Czechs fled to their Slavic kinfolk in the USSR. 10 years for espionage. All the Muscovites who did not evacuate Moscow when the Germans were approaching Moscow. 10 years for awaiting the Germans. Then there was a man who visited his parents 16 years before, 6 miles away. Unfortunately, he wasn't told that the area had been signed over to Poland at that time, so he got 10 years for counter-revolutionary activity. All of the prisoners of war, the amputees, the decorated heroes, were imprisoned not for what they did, but to keep them from telling what they saw when they were in Europe. Certainly an answer to how you're going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris. All the interned persons who were interned during the war in neutral countries, same thing, imprisoned for contact with the West. Now, the Germans, as we all know, liberated Berlin. The victorious armies returned home to parades, the accolades of their loved ones, heroes of the nation, heroes of the army, heroes of the revolution, got 10 years for contact with the West. Now, Solzhenitsyn points out the POWs knew they weren't guilty, but believed the priests were, who believed the engineers were, who believed the socialists were, who believed the communists were, who believed that they as individuals weren't, but that everybody else was, so it was all okay. And then there's the 1 million fugitives, people who fled from the Russian regime, were forcibly repatriated primarily by the British, In 1946 and 47, they got 10 years. By the way, Solzhenitsyn was furious, just furious about this. Then there were the Spanish children. During the Civil War in Spain, they brought these children to Russia to educate, raised them in boarding schools. They didn't fit in well, so they were labeled socially dangerous elements and sent off for 10 years. And then in the late 40s and 50s, to their surprise, they discovered that some people had survived the purges of 1937, so they were all rearrested and given 10 more years. So then they arrested what they called the vengeful children. The children of all those who had been arrested in the 30s, of course, had now grown up, and they were figuring that they might just be a little pissed off about what happened to their parents, so they gave them 10 years, which was now a sentence reserved for juveniles, since the standard sentence had now been raised to what they called a quarter, from a tenor, 25 years. In fact, when a prison official asked one prisoner what he had received a 25-year sentence for, and the prisoner said nothing at all, and the official said, nonsense, the sentence for nothing at all is 10 years. Now, not all made it to the camps. Between 1937 and 38, 500,000 political prisoners were shot, as were an additional 480,000 habitual thieves. And then, according to one other source, between 1937 and 1939, 1,700,000 were shot. Now, the question which should concern us, and my only reason for really picking this topic or picking this particular way to illustrate the topic, is the question, can it happen here? Actually, we could say that it is constantly happening here, but that with the vigilance of concerned individuals and the freedoms which currently exist, we've been able to neutralize the more blatant and egregious threats to our personal freedoms, sort of like the body's immune cells attacking a cancer before it can get established. My concern is that the less obvious threats get through, and by taking nibbles where bites would never be allowed, these totalitarian piranha fish could quite quickly consume us anyway. Free societies rarely collapse suddenly or as a result of direct frontal attack. They evolve out of existence. I was fascinated to discover years ago that Hitler came to power quite legally and remained quite preoccupied with furthering his most heinous goals under the cloak of legal precedent. Concern with legality, as I mentioned a while ago, is a preoccupation of the authorities which runs throughout Solzhenitsyn's book. So how are we doing? Well, in the area of legal precedent, we have Senate Bill 1, introduced a number of years ago now by Senator Ted Kennedy, that great patron of civil liberties. Senate Bill 1 and its transmutations, because it's evolved, this was the Omnibus Crime Control Bill, Crime Control Act, I think it was called for such things as one-person conspiracies. One reason the GPU, the internal police, tortured was even they needed to prove conspiracy, and one person wasn't enough. They knew that. Solzhenitsyn remarks on the fact that they got him for a 1.5-person conspiracy. If you feel that you're being surveilled by the government, you can be arrested if you try to trick them. So be very careful if you think you're being followed that you don't lose them. There can be arrest for hindering law enforcement. Somehow or other that's subtly different from obstructing. So general, though, that it's not revealing the source of a story could be construed as hindering law enforcement. Unreasonable noise could now be construed as disorderly conduct in order to obstruct a proceeding. Well, I guarantee you, if I'm up here talking, any noise is an unreasonable noise. And I have a hunch that there are a lot of testy judges who would feel the same way. Demonstrations to influence judicial proceedings could be penalized. Pentagon paper type exposés would be a criminal offense under provisions stating that it would be a criminal offense for a government employee to disclose in a newspaper or any person to publish national defense or classified information without the government being required to show intent to harm the nation or to aid a foreign power. Another key provision in this bill, psychiatric detention for 90 days without due process in times of national emergency. Detention camps to hold those being observed were designated 5 years ago. I understand they were disbanded after the press discovered them, but we're looking at attempts to erode rather than necessary. Well, we almost could include that in one of the new laws. Attempts to erode civil liberties. Then there's a list started under the when Nixon was vice president. was originally 4,000 names compiled from 2 different intelligence agencies of people who should be rounded up in time of national emergency. On what grounds? Psychiatric detention for 90 days for observation, because clearly anybody who would object to what's going on in this country is deranged. That list is now 9,000 computer pages long. Norman Mailer is the only one I know of who's on the list, and we all know what a threat he is to liberty. More recently, we have the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It was set up to coordinate emergency agencies originally, now runs all disasters. I assume it doesn't. Oh yeah, it's, hasn't noticed yet that it may be, promoting them. But one of the disasters that it's set up to handle, and we have earthquakes and so on, but man-made disasters. Well, what's a man-made disaster? Depends who's president, doesn't it? They talk about riots. If you have a war in Vietnam and people show up to march in the streets and protest, that could very well be considered a riot. But A-bombs, and one can only assume national emergencies, since a $100,000 grant has been authorized to study the possibility of using Golden Gate Park as a camp in an emergency. By the way, the head of FEMA, which is Federal Emergency Management Agency, is a friend of Ed Meese, who had his own private police organization in Orange County before being picked for this job. He sounds like a budding Berea, or Beria, I would think. Apropos of the psychiatric detention provision, it's interesting to discover how often we find organized psychiatry closely allied with threats to individual liberty, as well as the worst cases in modern history of direct government oppression. Perhaps it's because, as Dr. Lee Coleman points out in an interview in Freedom newspaper, psychiatrists have the legal authority to lock up a person who hasn't broken any law, to incarcerate someone in a state institution even though that person has done nothing which is hurting another person or broken any laws. Soviet psychiatry has helped to reduce the numbers of political prisoners in the Gulag by certifying them as insane and putting them into mental institutions. The Wall Street Journal in December of '84 mentions one psychiatrist who refused to do so and was now near death in a Soviet prison. By the way, there was a letter in that same issue of the Wall Street Journal from an inhabitant of the current Gulag, this was in 1984, that if the date were changed, I would have sworn it come right out of Solzhenitsyn's book, and yet he left the Gulag in the 50s. Not widely known, but well documented, that death camps evolved from legislation passed in the 1920s in Germany and the U.S., but a different political climate existed in the U.S. They evolved from this legislation providing for compulsory sterilization of the mentally ill, alcoholic, or socially undesirable. Well, glad that's not in effect now. There'd be a lot of us guys in here speaking with squeaky voices. A law for prevention of hereditary disease in posterity, that was the title of a book, was the title of the law, was passed within 4 months of the Nazis coming to power and became the legal basis for the extermination camps. And Human Selection and Racial Hygiene, which was a book, and that was the long term for eugenics, was a book written by several German psychiatrists which outlined the rationale and the propaganda campaign necessary for the implementation of a racial purification program. One psychiatrist who shared this view and began his career at the Institute of Hereditary Biology and Racial Research at Frankfurt was the now infamous Joseph Mengele that we hear so much about in the papers these days. So some other sources of danger. I got this from an article, Mark Holzer's article in Wealth in 1983. We now have the Postal Service thought police. They can't deliver the mail, so now they've got to start censoring what we get to read once it reaches us. So we have false ideas sent through the mail. Would be subject to confiscatory civil fines 7,000 times higher than criminal fines. It sets a maximum of $20,000 per day. And it has a hit list of 150 magazines, one of which is Prevention Magazine. I'm sure Reason is in there somewhere. A cease and desist could be issued on arbitrary bureaucratic fiat, deciding that a particular publication presents false ideas or misleading advertising, which would shut down a mail order business overnight. Once shut down, the forbidden mailing would also be prohibited from delivery by private carriers such as UPS, Federal Express, or even a hand delivery service. Some other ominous trends. The National Security Agency, which is larger than the FBI and the CIA combined, currently monitors every overseas phone call, overseas telex, and much overseas mail. Random body searches are being conducted in Europe by customs agents trying to find currency smugglers. U.S. Customs Service has currency violator profiles now, which isolate people suspected of taking money out of the country in violation of bank secrecy acts. There's a misnomer. Safety deposit boxes in every branch of Holland's 6th largest bank were subject to opening by battle-jacketed police accompanied by TV crews. They emptied 50 of them, sealed others, and confiscated all files. And then we have the Internal Revenue Service, my old alma mater. Private church schools whose beliefs are in conflict with public policy may, according to a recent Supreme Court ruling, be denied tax-exempt status by administrative authority. Next, can we expect administrative decisions as to what is a church, what beliefs are acceptable, and who is sincere? I think we're actually seeing that happen. Stock, bond, commodity, and bullion dealers must now divulge full financial information of each single transaction they make and report it all with the Social Security number to the Internal Revenue Service. Top marketing firms have been providing their mailing list to the IRS to help construct a lifestyle profile on taxpayers. Your 1040 form reveals not only the obvious, but your church affiliation, medical problems, children's ages. That's in case they fail to register for the draft, which to me is the ultimate tax. The location of your overseas and domestic bank accounts. There was Operation Leprechaun, a project conducted under the auspices of the IRS's intelligence gathering and retrieval system. It was finally halted in 1975 when exposed by a Senate committee. By then, had amassed over 450,000 names, the collection of which the Senate found had little to do with enforcement of the tax laws. That was from Freedom newspaper. By the way, I brought some copies of that Freedom newspaper because it has an interview in there with Lee Coleman and then also Thomas Saz, who's always been a favorite of mine, and mentions this Operation Leprechaun. And then we have the FBI and its infamous COINTELPRO operation. They used tax information gained from the IRS to disrupt the lives of its targets. As the Senate committee pointed out, the FBI used as a weapon against the taxpayer the very information the taxpayer provided pursuant to his legal obligation. And then, of course, we all know that our Social Security card is not for identification, right? It says so right on it. Of course. But it has actually become a national identity number. It's your driver's license number in 33 out of 50 states. It's your college ID number. It's on your Army dog tag, library card, and on your health plan. And it's the key to voter registration. It's the key to all federal information files on you, bank records, investment information, and personal secrets. And if you think of all the personal information on a job application or a loan application, and the fact that it's keyed to your Social Security number, I think we can see there that if only our Russian bureaucracy run amok had access to things like that, think what a much better job they could have done. And think of the job that can be done on us should the wrong person ever take control. So we get to the so what test. I always like to apply that. You know, all right, McKinley, you've said all this, so what? Solzhenitsyn was asking a question all through this book. And the question was why? Why would a government that came to power to right the wrongs and redress the grievances against the Tsar do things to its people that were far worse than anything that was ever imagined under the Tsar? And he answered it. And he answered it more or less in the same terms that I'm talking about, and that is that it was a system run amok. In actuality, you had a bureaucracy set up in the early days of the revolution that required people for them to stay in business. It's sort of like the Drug Enforcement Agency. You know, if there weren't pushers, they'd have to go and create them, and I understand the state of Idaho they did. It's an aside now I'm stuck with. I'll have to go on with it. In the state of Idaho, they went up there to see whether there was any drug traffic a few years ago, and they spent so much money that they turned Idaho into the drug capital of the Northwest. It's a sort of a client-patient relationship. You know, you have a prison system, and if you don't have anybody in it, all the people get laid off. So they had an elaborate system set up to supply people for these camps, and it acquired a life of its own. And Solzhenitsyn talks about it in terms of the great God, the state, because what we have here is a society where the people, willingly or otherwise, abandon responsibility for their own survival to the great God, the state. And he also sees it as a chronicle of the abuse of power. He uses himself as an example when he became an officer in the Russian army, the changes that occurred in him, and how embarrassed he is to look back and see how he treated others, having once gone into the camp system and seen what others in power can do to people. But what Solzhenitsyn has shown us so well is that we must look beyond a political ideology to its application. At what point will the dream touch reality? It's one thing to wrap a towel around your neck and say you're Superman. It's another to jump off the roof and try to fly. When we set out to right an injustice and choose government as the vehicle, it is with the most noble of intentions. And when we picture the implementation of the laws or programs which are created, it's a picture of a smooth functioning ideal scene. But the reality is most likely to be that towel flapping futilely around our necks as our dream goes crashing to the ground. To paraphrase Buckminster Fuller, government programs are designed by saints and executed by demons. All government programs and activities are planned with eyes on the heavens, with the ideal firmly in mind, but carried out as if the devil himself was the department head of every government agency. We shouldn't so readily give away our individual rights in the name of empowering government to stamp out some current evil, whether it's the czar, or drug traffic, or currency speculators, or tax evaders, or child abuse, or logging the redwoods, or zoning, or Cubans in Grenada, or pornography, or you fill in the blanks. There's always somebody, I guarantee you, will say, well, yes, but what about? And of course, that we need to regulate. The common good is always the justification for government intrusion into our lives. And what in the hell is the common good? When government makes a decision or takes an action or issues a statement, trace that action to its source, and you find not government or the common good or the common anything. You find some person there. That's somebody's cousin Wilbur making those decisions and employing that power. Is that what we had in mind? Hardly. Look at the person sitting next to you. Or think of your next door neighbor, or your cousin Arthur, or your cousin Wilbur for that matter. Think of just one person to whom you would be willing to give the power to run your life, bearing in mind it could well be the power to end your life. If you indeed find someone, I guarantee that he or she is not the one you would find if you followed government to its source. From here on, just to keep things in perspective, whenever I mention the word government, just substitute Uncle Wilbur. It sort of keeps things in perspective. One day a person is mismanaging his or her life just like the rest of us. And literally the next day he's mayor or councilman or arts commissioner or congressman or sheriff or whatever. What's changed? Now he can mismanage our lives as well. No matter how bad the idea, nor how crazy its proponent, we have little to fear so long as he must compete in the marketplace of ideas or economics for a following. But Lord help us if there's a government he can control, seduce, or corrupt. A government with the power and the inclination to serve as his proxy and impose his madness upon the rest of us. To restate that, when we speak of the operations of individuals, we are dealing with a flawed application of power. With that in mind, we can then begin to place in perspective the question of centralization of authority in the hands of government. Remember Uncle Wilbur. Because whatever authority we give government will be exercised by those flawed individuals. In the normal course of events, an individual's capacity to cause harm to himself is unquestionably infinite, and it should be. In the normal course of events, an individual's, whether through intention or misjudgment, but his capacity to harm others is limited. And one could raise the point that there is a direct negative correlation between any individual's flawed ineptitude and the large. Ordinary people did things which they cannot condone, cannot explain, and cannot live with. They were devoured by an institution which acquired a life of its own, a bureaucracy run amok. Soldiers, Marines, pilots, nurses, doctors, a generation of young Americans caught up in something like a runaway horse, which had taken over and was running and ruining not only their lives, but the lives of millions of others. Tragedies of this Gulagian scale can be prevented, but rarely stopped until they've run some sort of course. That's why a society needs a guiding philosophy which recognizes that it is the nature of government to contain the seeds of a malignancy which can at any moment consume its host, in this case, those it governs. The liberalism of 200 years ago is basically the libertarianism of today. America's founders created a government based upon all the most cynical assumptions about governments and their potential for abuse. The U.S. Constitution was not the product of some political creative writing workshop or the revolutionary byproduct of all-night sessions in smoke-filled rooms by the radical caucus of Americans for Self-Rule, People's Committee to recall King George. The Constitution was the codification of what had been determined in the political marketplace as a workable relationship between the citizen and his government. And if I may be so bold, the gist of it was that government is not to be determined in the political marketplace as a workable relationship between the citizen and his government. And if I may be so bold, the gist of it was that government is not to be trusted. So keep it as weak as possible and keep your eye on it at all times. What was overlooked was the fact that for anything to persist, it has to be continually created. At some point, whoever created that society where the individual was paramount and government was a far distant second, if in the running at all, stopped creating it, and it started to decay. Now there is a growing awareness of that decay, and as they were 200 years ago, the statist monarchists, read Republicans and Democrats, are encamped and enthroned in the seat of power, being challenged by upstart champions of the supreme rights of the individual, then the liberals, today the libertarians. And I just want to end with a quote I read in the Jefferson Memorial when I was back doing some lobbying for the American Economic Council, which sent a chill of recognition and inspiration through me, and it was cold, so it could have been that. It was about 20 degrees. But I walked in, and it's an impressive place, and it was like 2 in the morning, and we were getting ready to go back the next day, and I stood in this central, I guess you call it a rotunda, and I was looking at everything, and cold anyway. And I looked up, and there written around the top of the rotunda were these words: I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. And I think that's why we're all here today. Thank you very much.